So happy to see you all towards the end of the semester. This is one of our last public lectures, but we are privileged to have a very distinguished scholar with us. She traverses political science, international relations, gender studies, and is an educationist with a long background in the US and here. And she's been writing with a critical lens about Western approaches to the developing world. So there is this. There are many. One of them is popularly known as postcolonial theory. Then we have critical theory. Then there are also global South, South-centric theory, and so on, which try to challenge the dominant narratives and the mainstream portrayals of everything. So, in that context, Dr. Dhar has a solid reputation and a background. She's taught in multiple countries and is engaged with young people. So, I think this will be of high value to you. And do think about some of the points she's raising, because sometimes because of the intellectual hegemony of the Western literature, which is so dominant, and most of us refer to it as the primary source most of the time, we may not actually realize that we've internalized many of those ideas, right? So it's necessary to also unlearn some of those and to bring in our own, visions and views about what is happening and what has happened in the past, and how things stand in the world today. So politics is gendered. Politics is also driven by North-South dynamics.
That's right.
And I think what Dr. Dhar is going to do today is to get you to think about how these two intersect at some level. And I'm sure you have covered feminism in the class. There are different strands of feminism also. There's also very fierce and strong non-Western feminism, which emphasizes distinct differences from what they consider the privileged global North feminism. So all these strands are important for us to know. Whether you agree or disagree is not the point, but to get to see and to learn about these things is always important, so that you know that there are different ways of approaching and looking at the same problem. So over to Dr. Dhar, I just wanted to briefly introduce her, and we look forward to learning from this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cholia, and I'm very, very grateful to Dr. Cholia and to your professor, and to the Jindal University and to the India Institute. I was so impressed when I came first. I saw the very beautiful campus. But then after that, learning the work of the faculty here and learning, we're all your fans, all of us here. And so, so it was really very important for me to engage with all of you. I also wanted to share with you on a slightly informal note that I've come back to India after several years. And so there is that joy, that joy is, I have been in the US for the last 15 years. And I wasn't able to travel back to India for the last 7, and so when I came, there is that emotional side of it too, that I really wanted to share that with you, because I think for the last several years I was increasingly sort of having to, to face, if you will, both the intellectual as well as the personal, knowing that perhaps some of my work was not exactly located in the right place, and so also sort of moving through the world, looking for the right locations where I could continue, to do some of the work that I've been doing in England and in America. Because as you get more and more prominence, you kind of issues of location become that much more important, because there are pressures from everywhere, and where you're primarily located is the place where there is the greatest pressure, right? So, with that, I wanted to sort of start today's talk, and I wanted to call it Gender and the Politics of Representation in Indo-Western International Relations, because, many of us are committed feminists. We identify as feminists, and I've been doing work on gender equality ever since I was in college and so forth. And so, I've worked in rural India also, with tribal India also, and in those populations also, certainly in an urban and a middle class context. And in doing that work, but also sort of drawing from the postcolonial tradition, which, as Dr. Cholia was telling us, it is the tradition that challenges dominant Western narratives. I was increasingly being made aware of the fact that the very conscientious and very committed work that we all do as social activists and as gender scholars, etc., sometimes can unfortunately be represented in very different and problematic ways on a global level. And so how do we simultaneously address both of those issues was what increasingly became the focus of my work, right? And then I was sort of fortunate to find many others around the world, both in India as well as in the Metropolitan Academy abroad, who are also looking at non-Western approaches and who are also sort of trying to think of international relations not as a discourse where a group of powerful countries, whether it be the G7 or any other grouping, unilaterally dictates terms to the global South. But how do we forge a more equitable, a more equitable relationship? That has been the thrust of my work. So what I want to do is I propose to speak for just about 15 minutes, and then I want to open it up to a discussion, because I'm sure as I'm talking, many of you are going to be making those connections. And so for a while, you'll have to keep aside your 15 point stress, right, for the upcoming exams. You should learn something from my American students. When their exams are up, I'm the one that's stressed. So there's a yeah. So when we talk of international relations of a country, I know in an Indian context, we typically tend to talk from 1947, right? Because that's when we became independent, and so that's when we started forging relationships with the rest of the world. But for those of us who are post-colonial scholars, we go back several centuries before that too. Right? And so again, we are talking of British colonialism. And when you study these narratives of British historiography, it's very interesting, and so again, as I'm talking about some of this, I would encourage all of you, maybe not right away because you have your exams, but once that's over, I would encourage you to go back to the original documents. Because what you're hearing here is secondhand. Go back to the original documents and see the actual texts and how they, describe the problem. So at the time of colonialism, we have to remember it wasn't just a military enterprise, right? The military purpose of domination over the global South, which is Asia and Africa and Latin America, was accompanied by an intellectual enterprise too. Because remember, no enterprise can be successful unless it has an intellectual apparatus backing it. So military enterprises on their own do not succeed. And so you see, even in times today, you will find any type of military exercise accompanied by, say, an intellectual language of human rights and things like that, right? So there is an intellectual enterprise that's always at work. The intellectual enterprise at the time was coming in the form of European parliamentary debates. It was coming in the form of missionary discourses, who were talking of the heathens in these foreign lands who had to be, Christianized and sort of made more civilized, right? So there was that kind of discourse that was accompanying the military project of domination. So in that project, the description of gender was very interesting. And so you came across language like, one of the ones that I like to quote, but there's many. I mean, we're talking of thousands of, representations like that, so that it's not just an individual issue. Because I think sometimes the problem is once we see some of this thing, we kind of tend to say, well, this scholar has presented it that way, etc. It's not one person. These are discursive issues, so they are global. So, for example, in the 1880s, you had the kind of language in missionary discourses which would say the daughters of India are accursed at birth, they are unloved in childhood, they are uncared for as adults, and unlamented in their death. Right? So the daughters of India were made into one monolithic category. So that all of them, are oppressed, all in a similar way. And it didn't stop there, right? So we could say, well, sure, use that as a way to forward social justice, but that was not what it was being used for. What it was used for was for the justification of the imposition of colonial rule. So the body of the Indian woman at the time, and the bodies of, I would argue, again, you can make the connections between African women and, other women in the global South, that these bodies were seen as uncivilized, as uncared for, and as, so the body, the so-called oppressed body was then used as a justification for the backwardness of the body politic, right? And so the justification of colonial rule. And so gender was invocated in that way. And my argument, which is a provocative argument for any audience, certainly abroad, is that we see the same discursive strategies even now, even though obviously colonialism has ended. We see very proudly the tricolor here. But some of these discursive strategies continue. So I want to briefly cover 4 ways in which that continues now, also in the Metropolitan Academy, in ways that have profound consequences for domestic Indian politics as well as international representations, right? And then I'm going to open it up for us to both in terms of think about questions that might be coming up in your minds as well as talk about strategies, because ultimately the idea is, so what is the solution, right? So that's where this is all leading to. Do we stop the important work? No, of course we don't. We need to continue to work on social justice issues, but how do we do it in a way that we do not play into this problematic representational politics and the tremendous inequity that exists between the global north and the global south, right? And democracies such as ours. So the very first one certainly is generalization. So I talked about how in European parliamentary discourses we had, discussions of India's daughters. So they were one, so they were all seen to be in the same sort of situation, and everybody's situation was terrible. And so those generalizations continue even now. They are very, very prominent in Western feminist discourses. And we, and again, as postcolonial theorists in the academy also, we've written about it, we've pointed out several problematic texts and so forth. But like I said, it's a part of a bigger problem, and it continues on from times of colonialism, and so that doesn't really end. So if you think about, there were documentaries such as, if you think about Leslie Udwin's documentary, India's Daughters, that happened after Nirbhaya's rape, right? So that was a heinous rape. Obviously, there was, a lot of protest in India, as there should have been, and there were required changes in law, as there should have been. But at the same time, there were therefore, documentaries and other kinds of material released at the time, which said that this was the problem for India's daughters, right? And then what were some of the things that happened as a result of that? Obviously, outside of that representational politics, European universities started, and a couple of American ones at the time, started refusing admissions to Indian boys because they said this is their culture, and all Indian men are rapists, right? So this is how, an uncritical feminism can sometimes play into a very problematic global racism and global colonial practices, right? So those kinds of things were happening. Some of those became very public also, that these universities have, those letters were made public, where in one instance, I recall the department chair had written back to an Indian applicant saying, because he had written back with some anguish saying, that my application was strong, these were my ranks, these were my, my scores, etc., and whatever. And I was given to understand by the professor who would have been supervising my research that, that it was almost a done thing because he was doing very well, actually. And the chair wrote back to him to say that, yeah, we are not admitting Indian men because they're rapists. And that was a letter, right? And so these are some of the issues that I'm talking about, because once you can generalize the situation of all women and a so-called quote-unquote backward culture, then it's a short step, therefore, and so post-colonial theorists have kind of represented this in very interesting ways. Gayatri Spivak, for example, talks about colonialism as the project of rescuing brown women from brown men by white men, And so it becomes, it plays into that sort of thing. So there's that issue of generalization. The other thing that I have noticed, again, and this is something that I've talked about in talks there too, is that to the extent that there's a crime, say like a heinous rape, right, a gang rape, like the instance of Nirbhaya, and unfortunately, sexual violence is a global problem. And again, independently, we do need to keep addressing that. That when those are presented in the media abroad also, they are presented as, depending on where the crime has occurred, the representation in the media changes. Right? So when we are looking at crimes that occur, say, in India and in the global south more broadly, it is represented as a cultural backwardness problem. When a similar type of crime occurs in the US, for example, it is represented as individual actions of individual criminals. Right? And so that, again, is the difference. I can give you, again, empirical data on how in the year that Nirbhaya's rape happened, which is 2013, in that same year, there were 4 similar gang rapes that happened in the US, including 2 on university campuses. Again, where student athletes, male student athletes had raped. In one instance, it was a very sad and heinous case where, a group of male athletes had raped this young girl who was their batchmate in the college, and had left her body there and so forth. And then a lot of the people took pictures and they released it online, which again led to a whole lot of cyberbullying. In one of the instances, there was suicide. So there's so these are again very heinous and unfortunate realities of sexual violence that exist around the world. But again, in its representation, nowhere did we see in any media representation, from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times to the, to the Washington Post, certainly to a lot of these spaces, that there was never an indictment of Western culture or American culture. We didn't talk of it as a rape culture there. But when you see similar things represented in media, representations, actually even domestically, because again, as Sir was saying here, that we unconsciously internalize some of these things. We have been told for centuries that our culture is backward. We have internalized some part of that, right? So therefore we see that happening in our own media representations also, where it's then presented as, because if it's a culture problem, then it's a global cultural problem. Right? If it's individual criminals, then it's individual criminals everywhere. But that's not the frame we use. We change the frame of reporting based on where some of this is happening. So that's the second one. The third one, then, again, very interestingly, is that, again, in my time in the US, I have been invited to countless vigils. So every time there's, something to do with gender violence or gender inequalities in some of our countries, there's a vigil outside. So hundreds of people will turn out. We'll say, this needs to change in India and so forth. And again, I mean, as those of us who work on social justice are generally happy at the thought of people congregating for social justice anywhere, because we believe that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. But again, it's in this skewed representation of these things, and that I have never seen anything comparable in the global south, in any country, not just India, but there's all these crimes happen in in England. There's a sexual violence case that happens here. There is something else that happens there. There are but. I've never seen this type of a phenomena where Indians or Sri Lankans or that we are sort of congregating on the streets and saying, bring justice to American women. American women are oppressed, depressed by their culture. We don't have that, right? But this is a phenomena there where you've got hundreds of people. And so I found after a time when I was invited, I started sort of framing it in this way after that. Where we were saying that we, on one hand, we need to sort of acknowledge what has happened. On the other hand, I want us to use this moment to affirm our support for transnational, efforts to combat these things, including those that are happening here. Because otherwise, we are playing into a very problematic sort of racial frame. And in some of those talks, some of my fellow feminist speakers would get upset about it, because they'd say, now is not the time to talk of racism and colonialism, right? Now is not the time. And my point is that every time is a time. Anytime it's a time to talk about gender, it's a time to talk about race. Or anytime it's a time to talk about any type of injustice which is being framed in certain kinds of ways. We have to remain cognizant of how our work is being used, and we have to remain cognizant of how it's, and so during that time, again, I'm talking several years ago when I was doing my PhD, that was when I sort of also started being drawn to what are some, Indian feminist traditions, and so because I was beginning to realize some of the limitations of the Western liberal feminist framework in addressing some of these issues here, So these were some of them. The other final sort of example, I talked to you about generalizations, about the individual versus the cultural backwardness framing, about vigils and congregations, that have a different type of visual and spatial politics. When hundreds of people congregate, there's a power to that. There's a visual power to that. There's an energy that you feel, the energy of the crowd, which can sometimes, crowds can do terrible things too, as in riots. But crowds can also achieve the impossible, sometimes like the Nirbhaya rape, etc., where so many laws changed as a result. Crowds have power. In democracies, they have power. And so, and so how the energy of that crowd is being mobilized is an important thing, right? Because it can be channeled into very different kinds of directions, which can then have repercussions for the next 100 years. So, so that becomes very important. And therefore, I increasingly began to feel the need to take this work outside of just the academy and sort of start engaging with people and so forth. So that's when I started actually writing for newspapers, etc., because that's the way to reach audiences that aren't just in universities, because that's very important. So those kinds of things. And finally, then to talk about rankings. Right. So again, and that's the final example I'll give, where again, when I've been invited to talk about gender issues and various different kinds of talks and so forth, the person introducing me, I'm very glad you didn't do that today. You didn't, release a list of rankings about where, and it's that's usually the usually the experience in a lot of these talks, where they'll sort of talk about. I'll see you later. Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of events happening. I'm so glad to the university for organizing this at such short notice. Yeah, so there's a lot of, that data that gets thrown at you when I mean, sometimes I've just been flummoxed because you're a speaker, you can't really sort of challenge the person who's introducing you. But I recall a talk at, I think it was Boston and Brandeis, and it was, again, I mean, very good, sort of organizing, etc. That's wonderful. But you're introduced with a sort of rank, that India is second only after Afghanistan in that instance, we were told. And I'm wondering, how are these ranks, because there's a lot of countries in the world, and there's a lot of places, even in our own South Asian context, as well as certainly in the broader Indo-Pacific context, where I am aware as a scholar that the GDI is far lower than what it is in India. So obviously there is something going on, which is then, which is manipulating, etc., whatever. And so I was hearing that the Observer Research Foundation is kind of working on its own ranking systems, etc. And I think there should be more and more efforts like that. We may agree or disagree, but I think we need to have challenges to one dominant sort of way of seeing things, so that more people can think about, well, is there something skewed and biased built into this, and to what extent is it being mobilized? And so I think that. And so I want to end with that. I think that's the issue here. That on one hand, it's very important to continue to work on social justice issues, but on the other hand, how is it being used in ways that then have repercussions? So, to talk, just to sort of mention two lines very briefly about repercussions. Obviously, in a domestic sense, then we kind of, that has repercussions here. But on an international IR level and a global level, what's then happening is obviously that narrative, that India is not a democracy, for example, or other kinds of narratives that kind of paint the country in a certain kind of way, which is more than just. Because I think that's the emphasis of my talk too, that I am personally, again, we are critical thinkers, so we are very comfortable with critique, and if you don't criticize a social injustice, you can't solve it. We understand that, so the point here is not to push things under the carpet. The point is, again, that representational politics, because once you are saying it's not a democracy, then it has an impact on funding, it has an impact on foreign direct investments. It has an impact on the kind of pressure that, again, powerful nations can put on you to toe a certain foreign policy line, which is to their economic benefit and not ours, right? So those kinds of things. And so how do we deal with it? How do we both continue to do the important work while at the same time sort of making sure that it doesn't fall into this type of representational politics? I think that's the focus here. And so I want us to hold both of those thoughts together, that in all of the talks and all of the spaces that I'm talking about right now, they're also doing incredibly important work. Don't get me wrong, they're doing very important work. But again, there is a dominant Western liberal feminist narrative within which some of the kind of work that I think is important sort of either gets sidelined or, worse, gets punished oftentimes. It gets punished. And I can be certainly candid enough to say that countries that usually like to teach the rest of the world how to be good democracies don't always do a fabulous job themselves at living up to their own, and so that happens, right? And obviously that has a lot of, security and other sort of ramifications for the country. So how do we do this work as well as avoid the problematic representational politics? That's really, that's, I think we need to hold both of those frames together, especially when we are, looking at the representation of our work, in sort of global levels. It becomes, it's lesser, I think it's less center stage when we are doing very localized, village level, community level, tehsil level work, but it becomes more and more and more. And again, even on those levels, remember the funding is coming from global organizations too. So those reports are written up in certain kinds of ways and so forth. And so, these connections are incredibly important. And over time, I've begun to see some of those connections as deserving of both scholarly attention as well as, of activist sort of consideration that, how do we frame, some of the work that we are doing in ways that, avoid some of these pitfalls that we've seen for, I think, hundreds of years at this time. So I'm going to end it there. And I'm going to open it up to questions if you have any, but also, as I've been talking, I want to open it up to your understanding of solutions. We've discussed what the problem is. What do you think can some of the solutions be? Right? So I want us to talk, a little bit about that, and also if you had any questions. So I'll give it over to you all. Yes?
So since we're talking about, say, international relations, and we briefly have also talked about diplomatic relations, especially between India and the West.
Right.
So how do you think gender discourses, like we talked about, influence policies and decision-making processes in the diplomatic relations between India and the Western nations?
Right. Policies that are made globally, or you mean Indian foreign policy?
International policies.
International policies directed at India, you mean? Right. I think that's a great question, and I think it influences it in again so many of these ways. Gender is a very important part of the world's understanding of democracy. For example, is a country a democracy or not? And that's again come down from colonial times when we would have sometimes even well-intentioned narratives saying that how a country treats its women. And now I would add sexual minorities also, right? That becomes a marker of how civilized it is, how democratic it is, and so forth. And so, for example, that we've had progressive Supreme Court rulings now, which have positively impacted the LGBT community, and that there was a lot of and ironically, again, that was a draconian colonial law that was very homophobic, and that to fight that, it's taken us, more than a century to give justice to, to our sexual minorities, and so the representation of that continues to be very important in international policy, right? That that there is that pressure, and again, some global pressure can be good if it is looking at changing something that is inherently unjust. But again, to bring it back to what I was talking about, that pressure is never mutual. It's never mutual. Again, as I said, I've worked in the US for the last 15 years. There's a great deal of homophobia there. Just because a law has changed doesn't mean the society and every section of it accepts everything, right? And so you still have picketing, outside of organizations. You still have, so you have that. And but again, in the representation, it differs. And so I want to end my answer with sort of also saying, in terms of foreign policy and looking at the representation of women within that, that I had begun to write an article on the representation of women in the highest, levels of Indian foreign policy in terms of, Indian ambassadors to the US and, other foreign secretaries and so forth. And then I decided to tweak the article a little bit and also look into how well US has done on that. And if you see that article, that's actually available online. It was published in the Outlook. And it's called Why Diplomacy Remains Male-Dominated and the Need to Make It a More Diverse Space. And my research led me to see that the US has done no better. Each country has had four. Each country has really just had four women ambassadors to the other, So India has sent 4 women ambassadors to the US. US has done the same here. And so, but if you see, and people were startled to see those figures. Because we would expect, that countries that tell us how to do our social justice better would have a better record themselves, but often that's not the case. So it's also in how the West represents itself. The West has always represented itself as the repertoire of and the promoter of human rights, even when it has not been so, right? And some lives have been considered more valuable than other lives, but it's not said out loud. And so again, so it's really the domination of that framework, and how I feel, certainly in India, we're always sort of apologetic. No, come and see our democracy, come and see our elections. You don't see similar kind of stuff coming out from that side. None of those countries will ever invite us and say, come and see for yourselves that we are a democracy. I've been on university campuses there. I've seen students being arrested, sometimes for reasons that I cannot see why they were arrested for. Arrests are only for, if you commit acts of violence or if you threaten violence. If you merely state a position that some people disagree, that is not a ground for arrest in a democracy. We can agree to disagree and that's it. But students are arrested. If you read the newspapers, even now, American newspapers, see how many students are being arrested for just non-violent protest. That is not the work of a democracy, but are our countries talking about it? I think we are now a little bit. In Colombia, it's happened. It's happened in a lot of universities. And so the tremendous intimidation of students just for non-violent congregation, which is a right in a democracy, is a. Right, and I think that I'm told that we are. Right, and I think that though that there is so much talk around it, right, that activists are talking about it, I think that people are doing such important work, sort of raising that issue, and I'm sort of really appalled to see how the countries abroad that are also doing the same thing also then join the that it's the same. I mean, if you see what's happening over, I mean, now with, students that are talking of a two-state solution in terms of Palestine, for example, which is a very reasonable position to have, actually. There's nothing so, to use a Hindi word, aflatuni about that position, to say that there's been, this unrest that's been going on in the Middle East for so long. And at some point, we need to sort of come to a diplomatic and peaceful solution on both sides, which is the position that our own government has taken also. Dr. Jaishankar has taken that position. It's a very nuanced position, saying that, on one hand, we obviously do not condemn, we do condemn acts of violence against civilians. On the other hand, we need to find a long-term solution. That's a very reasonable political and international policy solution. But students who are saying this in American universities are being put in jail as we are talking, right? And so that's my point, that these spaces are shrinking globally. I agree with you. But that, again, the representation tends to be, that's the representation. And the countries that are doing it, I mean, I have and I mean, again, because I've taught there for so long, I've also seen things that I haven't really seen in Indian universities. Some sense, I don't know if it's patriotism, but I really think that in some ways it is worse there. Because in so many universities there, you've actually got members of the American intelligence, of CIA, etc. Yahan pe if you have RAW in every university campus, we will all go up in arms. So we don't do that. But I mean, they are there and they are putting the students on the list, on the FBI list, for just stating a position that the university doesn't agree with, in a way that those students will be hounded for the rest of their lives. When you put on an FBI watch list, it's not a small thing. You're 17 years old, आपने idealistically एक धरना join कर लिया. You have not done anything political. You've not committed any act of violence. You have not threatened violence. You have not broken any law. None that I'm aware of. None of my students I'm aware of have ever sort of threatened, let alone commit any act of violence. But if you're put on an FBI watch list, that's pretty much I mean, that's going to carry around for the rest of your life. And then there is also very irresponsible commentary. I can say this very, very, very honestly, because it's been covered in all major newspapers, including actually wonderfully The Guardian, etc., out of the UK also, where even leaders of the Democratic Party, anytime these students were talking about a peaceful two-state solution, etc., leaders of the Democratic Party, including people like Nancy Pelosi, etc., said that they are taking their directions from Moscow. A white 17-year-old Midwestern white student who's acting from a space of idealism and saying, that so many civilians are dying every day, we need to do something about it. How is that child taking their direction from Moscow? But, but the moment you say ki Russian agent hai, then that's it. Again, that is the end of your, because in the US, that's what you're told, right? And 17-year-olds being told this and then being put in jail and so forth and put on all these lists, I would say that these are not the actions of a democracy, and certainly not the actions of democracies then teach the rest of the world how to be democracies, right? And so I think, but we have this sort of, I mean, on a level, I think there's a disillusionment with the West that's growing, but I think we need to critique it more. We need to critique more the moral ground, even as we as transnational communities work towards improving situations everywhere. I think we need to critique very strongly, and I say this very, very intentionally, we need to critique the moral ground on which the West claims to stand to preach to the rest of the world. I do not think they have that moral ground. They do not have that historically, they do not have that contemporarily. And once we understand that, then I think we can all work together. And I think we were talking about solutions. I think part of my one of the ideas I would certainly have for solutions is to talk about transnational solidarities in that way, right? To understand that you are no better than us, and then let's all work together to improve the situation. For me, that would be the frame. But I sort of, over time, especially because I have seen with my own eyes what happens on campuses there too, etc. So I'm far less, bright-eyed about, how things are so much better there, which is what we are told. I mean, things are materially better, certainly, things are materially better. But, but there isn't that moral ground. Yeah, other questions, other solutions, other...
So I just wanted to ask, how do post-colonial studies and the location of gender within post-colonial studies influence our understanding of sort of cultural production or performance or of the systems that sort of came up during the colonial period, and what impact has it had on even post-colonial art or literature or in popular culture in general?
Right. I think when we are bringing in the word post-colonial, we are sort of, in a sense, affirming our understanding of what colonialism's done to us, right? And so I think within post-colonial clusters, if you will, and within spaces that are sort of deeply aware of the continuing sort of colonial, interventions that happen around the world, that I think art and resistance, the kind of things that you're talking about, which are incredibly powerful, I think they take on a different sort of, they do take on a different kind of note. For example, I mean, again, something that I've seen which is very powerful in India is, the concept of nukkad natak. Again, which is very localized. It's very localized. It's not drawing from, the convention on, the CEDAW and this and that. And it's sort of, it's speaking to local audiences, and it's drawing from very local motifs. And I think what your question is also sort of, veering on is also sort of this understanding, in a sense, that again our local cultures do have, we do have local cultures of resistance that have nothing to do with the West. Again, if you see in villages also, maybe some of you have heard of the Gulabi gang, the women who were, things like that. They are not westernized. They don't know English. They are not learning from Mary Wollstonecraft, etc., whatever. So these kinds of movements for justice have always happened, in the post-colonial world too, like in the colonial world. For example, if you look back to, when sati was decriminalized, when sati was criminalized, 1829, right? 1856 was when the Widow Remarriage Act came in, so then widows were given the right to. So the way it is presented in colonial historiography is that the West came and civilized these countries. And what is hidden is the whole sort of history of local protests. Not just leaders of movements like Ram Mohan Roy, etc., and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, etc. There were obviously, we had, our thinkers like that, but also many, many people who will never have a name. We won't know their name. But they made incredible sacrifices, and they were fighting for social justice. वो अपने लोग थे. And they were not working on any, sort of Western agenda. They were working, for social reform. And a lot of that gets invisibilized. And instead, the discourse on the global level tends to be that, oh, we went and we civilized them, right? And you see a lot of that in missionary discourses even now. Where, we can, where very important things of like, addressing, say, caste inequities or addressing, things like that, which are important social justice issues, get couched within something, they get subsumed within something that is completely different. And then it becomes, okay, they need to be Christianized. Then it will go, you have Dalit Christians, you have Pasmanda Muslims, caste to har jagah ho raha hai, right? So there are these inequalities. And again, when we get together, we find ways to address social justice in ways that don't get subsumed by something else. That you have there's a whole tradition of critique. I want you to know that there's a whole tradition of critique even in the West against some of these missionary discourses. Here in India, we tend to think that critiques of missionary discourses is something that is very much about our own countries, only our own countries do it. No, even within the Western Academy, there is a critique of that. And we talk instead of interfaith dialogue. If you are saying that all people of a certain religion need to be converted into another religion in order to be civilized, you have a problem there. There's a problem, right? That kind of problem also impacts on communities like, say, tribal communities. They have their own practices. They are not hegemonic. They don't follow, a lot of times, hegemonic Hindu practices. They also don't follow hegemonic, Christian. Unko aap agar bol rahe ho that no, you all have to be Christianized in order to know. That goes against every principle of diversity. Right? But then there are these larger religious enterprises that come into play that are saying, no, tribals have to give up their own ways of life and they have to sort of, jahan pe social justice ki issues hai, wahan pe obviously the state has a role to play. But if that is couched in a way that into this problematic politics of conversion, that it's only when you are all Christians that somehow, that's obviously an issue. Just as if we would say that for any other religion too, right? I mean, my own framework tends to be one which is about interfaith dialogue. I tend to think that all of these, when I was abroad, I used to visit a lot of these different churches, and I saw a remarkable diversity of practices even within Christian churches. So you have the very homophobic churches. You have the churches that have extremely gender equal. I've got up sometimes and walked out because I can't hear the tremendous sexism and misogyny that is being said in some of those spaces. But conversely, if you go down the spectrum, you will also have you're also going to have very progressive churches. I went to one church where the minister was atheist. And that's so remarkable. He said that, because, and I was making connections with Hinduism, where again you have these different ideas. Atheism is a concept within Hinduism too. Just as we have different notions of God, Sagun, Nirgun, etc., we have different notions of the formless God versus the God with form. Similarly, we have ideas where you can be a good person even without a belief in God. So karma yoga, aapke kaam agar achhe hain, you don't need, if you are there for people, then that is one way. So you can there can be one route through, and some of this work is actually covered in Indian feminist approaches too. Where there is Gyan Yoga is one. Gyan as a teacher, teachers who share knowledge. That's a way to the divine. Karma Yoga, doing good deeds for those that are needy, that's a way to the divine. So there are these kinds of different paths which are not, there's bhakti obviously, and there's, there are those paths. But these paths to the divine that don't have to do with rigid religious rituals only, that is there in every faith. And it is there too. But that's the point that I'm trying to make, that within every faith also, there are different kinds of practices. All of it gets collapsed. And on a global level, we are told that some religions are civilized, other religions are backward. And the only way to sort of, raise the standard of these people is for them to, that's problematic. And that's seen as problematic also in many parts of the West.
So basically the entire idea is about otherization.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah.
But with decolonization, post-colonial India and Pakistan, we see that same framework is being used in our societies now, for minorities, for groups that are not majority.
Right.
Aren't we replicating the same frameworks?
Right.
And then the question of charting national solidarities.
Right.
So
That's
how do we
right.
basically bridge these to reconcile?
Right. And I think for me, again, it's been, because I tend to see Indian diversity as such a beautiful thing and a remarkable thing. I mean, we have all these different communities that have made such incredible contributions to the nation, and so sort of certainly, sort of highlighting that, because I think obviously, in every when vote bank politics comes into play, there are some problematic things that come in, everywhere. That there are issues like that. But I think, sort of again, because I think the point that you're raising is so important, that sometimes the post-colonial project can mimic some of the more problematic aspects of the colonial one, and how to sort of remain mindful of that, right, as we are building our solidarity. I don't know, my own framework tends to be that a country is only as strong as all of its communities. And that it's only when we all work together, and we understand. Because the more we have, it's like a family too, right? Like if you're fighting within a family, then outsiders can take so much more advantage of that, But when you're united within, then it is harder for outsiders too. And so that unity is important on every level. It ultimately does not help anybody for there to be, So I think we need, and I think we're having more and more conscientious educators from every community, from every part of the country, including parts that were not looked at as much, like the Northeast, for example, etc. Now that we are sort of seeing it all as, and I think those are positive steps. There is some work ahead, but yeah. Did folks have any other questions, but also any other solutions that you can think of? Yeah.
The solution, but I have a question.
Yeah.
So basically, there's this whole new concept of regressive feminism, right?
Right.
How do you think that plays out in the global arena, especially with the global north and global south divide? And also, can you please elaborate on how the intersection of regressive feminism can, with like other social justice movements, affect like anti-racism or like LGBTQIA plus movements?
Right. I have, so here's the thing. So now here's the feminist talking, because I sometimes have trouble holding these two thoughts together. Like, if it's feminism, then it isn't regressive. If it's regressive, it probably, And so I typically tend to think of that. But I mean, the way we have defined feminism, and certainly as post-colonial theorists, the way we see feminism is really a movement to end social injustices. And in that formulation, we look not just at gender, but we look at its intersections with all of these. So you can't speak of gender without speaking of race. You can't speak of that without looking at, issues of poverty, for example, right? So privileged women, for example, have a very different life in terms of life opportunities than the poorest women, who are, even now as we're talking, there are women in construction work. They're in the unorganized sector. So what is what kind of opportunities do I have? What kind of opportunities does that person have, right? Our experience of being women is not the same. And so then we have to sort of, look out for the poorest of our communities also. So that's very important. That kind of thing is important. But I think, other than that, I think my own approach tends to be that, for example, even for LGBT work, that there is a lot of there are a lot of progressive ideas even within our own cultural corpuses, that oftentimes gets, because to the extent that we talk of LGBT equality and justice, we tend to think that it's a Western discourse. And that's again how it's been manipulated globally. Because if you think of Article 377, that was a colonial, that was a colonial law. I want to use another example, a connected example, to make the larger point that I'm making, that before some of these problematic sections that came into the Indian Penal Code, which are a colonial gift to us, really, a quote-unquote gift, that there was considerable more fluidity in some of these, some of these spaces and some of these sections. Within our own cultural corpus also, we have ideas like the Ardhanarishwara, the idea of, critiquing the gender binary, of looking at gender fluidity. If you look at the artistic, and that also sort of leads to your question, about artistic representations, etc. If you look at the work of, we lost a very talented director very early in his life, but Rituparna Ghosh, the queer Bengali film director. If you see some of his films, Chitrangada, etc., they are beautiful, not only in their approach to LGBT equality, but in how they are drawing from indigenous cultural traditions, our own texts, our own ideas, within spiritual thought, within literature, within culture. And these things get entirely erased. I edited a volume, and it was called Love is Not a Word, the Culture and Politics of Desire. And in that, we had a very talented author writing about, again, the LGBT discourse. She was writing right after the Supreme Court ruling. And I had told her that show us some of the vernacular writing. And again, that gets erased. That there are such powerful vernacular literatures, talking about some of these issues. I mean, some of them have become famous now, Ismat Chughta's, Lihaf and things like that. Some of those, and, those also have, some issues. But there's a tremendous corpus of that type of writing within indigenous traditions. हम लोगों को पता ही नहीं होता है. A lot of times we don't know, because again, that is the way it is represented globally, that any type of progressive discourse is necessarily coming from the West, and then all we can do is either accept it or reject it. But we don't really look at, some of our own, models to see if there are ideas. My solution, generally, speaking of solutions, mine tends to be a more hybrid one, which generally sort of talks about, again, a dialogue between all of these. Let's find ideas like this within our own culture. There are ideas like that abroad, and then we can have productive collaborations. Then it's not a collaboration of hierarchy, right? Then it's not presented, social justice projects are then not presented as the white man's burden, that we have to civilize the rest of the world. But that there are, that there is an understanding of, I don't know how many of you have actually gone into Indian villages and worked in some of those places, and it's hard. I mean, I know when I first went into one of my projects, I was an urban girl, and I had no skills, like how to, there were snakes, there were, the very first night, I came in from Oxford and feeling, like I had my Oxford degree and everything. And one night I went in to stay there, and there was a figure outside the window as I was changing. And I was, full of my feminist thinking, मैं जाके तो झाड़ लगाऊंगी इसको, who's standing outside my window as I'm changing. And I opened and I realized it was a bear. So, you can have, भालू मुझे पता नहीं आप लोगों ने देखा है कि नहीं, दो पैरों पे खड़ा हो सकता है वो. And if it is standing like that, from a distance you can feel it's a fat guy. And I screamed and I ran inside, और सुबह को मुझे कोबरा भी दिख चुका था. And then फिर रात को भालू भी दिख गया, रात को शेर की दहाड़े सुनाई दे रही हैं from the hills, and you realize that, your Oxford degree is useless, in that type of a space, because I don't have the skills. And I called up my father, I said, Baba, what should I do? He said, या तो आना है या वहाँ रहना है तो सीखना है, because you can't call me every day with Baba, what should I do, right? And so the next few months were really about learning how to walk in the jungle, how to, and I did a lot of writing around it also at the time, that, creative writing pieces also, you sort of learn to, when I left that place, now I know how to deal with the snake. You can put me in a place with snakes, I'll know how to, find my way and protect myself from animals and snakes. And it's learning that my textbooks abroad could not have taught me, right? And when you're working in communities like that, you have to learn some of these things. And so the reason I'm saying this is that, I would encourage us to put ourselves in situations that might not, I'm not saying, put yourself in dangerous situations if you're not prepared. But some of these things can be useful to learn what textbooks will not teach us. It can also show us the realities of issues sometimes that, that we don't necessarily see in, say, Delhi, right? Because again, we're sitting in, say, air-conditioned spaces, we don't really know. And in those spaces, I was so impressed and so humbled to see some of the tremendous feminist work that some of those communities are doing. Some of those women have never gone to school. And so the idea is that that sense of social justice is not just taught, that people know inherently, communities inherently know ये गलत हो रहा है हमारे साथ, हम काम कर रहे हैं, हमको काम के पैसे नहीं दिए जा रहे हैं, ये गलत बात है, ठीक है? Once they have that sense, yeah, that these men are coming back, they're getting drunk, they're beating us. Domestic violence was a huge problem in those places. It was also tied up with sort of, the men would sort of get really drunk, etc., and then they would come and do this. And then the women decided, okay, what are we going to do? So they came up with their own solution. Now see, this is a village, right? So it's not, you can't call and order McDonald's. घर पे बन रहा है, चूल्हे पे खाना बन रहा है वहाँ पे. The women said, हम खाना नहीं बनाएंगे अगर आप लोग ये करेंगे. So the women just said, we are not going to cook. And so they all got together and so forth, and that changed the community. Something like that. We are not going to cook for you, your children, you're this, you're that. And so once they got together, these are incredibly powerful feminist movements, and they are happening without any intervention or even notice from the West. So again, sort of remembering that some of these things happen in our own, there is incredible social justice work that is happening within our own spaces too, and that it's incredibly important to sort of bring in some of these understandings. And I see, wherever I see, if I look at our scriptures, if I look at our religious texts, I find all kinds of ideas there. I find ideas that I want to critique, that I don't want to hold on to, but I also find ideas that are incredibly progressive for their times. Right, so there is that too, and so again, texts are products of their times. You can interpret them in different ways in light of the modern era, and similarly with other kinds of things too. That there are local practices of resistance. That there are interpretive ideas that can be sort of put into interpreted in different kinds of ways for the kind of work we do. My own solution tends to be that. And one of the other solutions for me concerns media representation, when I want to see more diverse media representations rather than one narrative, right? You need to have multiple, life is about multiple truths. If you see it from a different side, the truth changes. And so to use some of these things to talk about issues that are also happening in the rest of the world. Again, I'm going to say a very provocative thing, which I know some people may not agree with, but I have seen that sometimes, even in the media here, people are very scared to publish a criticism of a developed country. Like if you publish something about India, it gets taken, Again, someone may agree with it, someone may not agree with it. That's different. But people are scared to publish also. They will put it as, these are the author's own, obviously it's always the author's own, but something like that. And so again, it points out to me a very skewed sort of, position of representation. Again, remember, see, again, I think, and I want to again sort of emphasize that a lot of times our work changes based on our audience also. So for me, for the longest time, for like I said, 15 years, the setting has been both settings where I see what is happening in practice is not what is being said in theory, right? In terms of whatever democratic practices or whatever else, I have been at Oxford, I have been at, I've talked at, I think, a huge number of the Ivy Leagues at this point in the US, and certainly taught in America for so many years. I have not seen workplaces which do not punish you for not towing the line. I'm talking of the West, right? And so again, for me, my work is very much shaped by that, that if it is the case that everywhere there is a shrinking of democratic space, if it is the case that, and I don't know if it's a shrinking, because the shrinking implies that it was earlier there in a very pure form and then it's not there now. I don't think it's also as simple as that, right? But that again, that gets represented in such a way. And that in university, I think the biggest irony that I have encountered is that right when there is, democratic silencing of, say, American students on an American college campus, at the same time, some of the professors are giving commentary to the rest of the world on how to be democracies. It's happening at the same time. And so the way that professor gets to do that is by remaining silent about what's happening on their own campus or in their own country. because your career does not advance otherwise if it's not if you're not towing the line in quite that way. So I think that that's a very, very important it's a very important perspective to keep in mind. I know some of us are probably sort of seeing the West in the way that I did prior to my going, for example, right? But I think the way I tend to see it is that I think I have a more balanced view now. I remember when I first went abroad, I assumed that there's certain things I assumed which were true. For example, the material wealth, the greater standard of living. I mean, when I came back to India, I had to get used to, bijli ja rahi hai. You have to get an inverter. I was just telling, some of the folks here that, I was having to deal with, there are mice in the house right now. I have to learn to deal with that. So I've dealt with snakes, so I'm sure I'll be able to deal with the mice. But it's interesting how outside of the material differences, and again, that's a whole different lecture on how a lot of the material wealth of the West has come off from the post-colonial world, from the global South. Where is the wealth of Europe coming from? Think about that. But aside of that, those contexts, that there is the rest of it I have not seen. I think we tend to think that countries abroad are more democratic. I think they're more sophisticated. Being more sophisticated is not the same as being more democratic. They are more sophisticated in the forms in which they mask the ways in which democratic rights are taken. The narratives may change. They will be careful in terms of what they put in writing and what they don't put in writing, what can be proven, because they are very legal cultures. So you learn very quickly that people know how to put things in a certain sort of way so that it's harder to prove. But generations of Bollywood films have taught us just because something is hard to prove doesn't mean that it didn't happen, right? And so those kind of sophisticated systems, I think, are just better at masking things from the rest of the world, but they are not, take my word for it, they are not more democratic, and forms of repression and forms of silencing are, you pay the price everywhere for not towing the line, and the degree to which you pay the price and how you pay the price and how much of it is visible, that may change, but yeah. So again, any other questions, any other solutions? I want to hear at least one or two things by way of solutions. It could be, in a certain sector also. Like, for example, I know we talked about the media and how, we can represent things in a certain way in the media so that it's a more balanced representation, that's not putting countries in some sort of a hierarchical relationship. But even otherwise, I think that there can be, what do you think would be the solution in activist spaces? Or any other, really. Let's think of, I know it's a complex problem. Complex problems are harder to solve, right? That the solutions are harder, they are more complex. But do we have any preliminary ideas? Do you think, given what we have, so here's my question, given what I've talked about, do you think it's still productive to think in terms of international and transnational collaborations and coalitions? I tend to think that it is, that we can still find ways to possibly in some instances still work together, but that it requires a tremendous amount of reflection and attention to issues of inequity and so forth. So then let's end it for now here. But then again, if you had questions, ma'am will have my email, etc., if you wanted to get in touch afterwards and so forth. But I want us to think about this and go back to some of the original texts that I'm talking about, whether in colonial historiography or in some of the reports that are published now and so forth. And, you'll see the starkness of the representation there. And then sort of think about how sometimes it's just a simple case of, obviously the issue is much larger than just language, but that sometimes it's also just about representing things in a slightly different way, like writing up our media reports, etc., in a way, emphasizing that certain things are, like gender violence is a global problem, right? Emphasizing that also allows, it doesn't also, the other good thing that it does is also that it doesn't take away from the important work that organizations are doing in the West also. So that, so again, I want to end with this one quick example. The important Universal Women's Rights Declaration, CEDAW, right? Yeah. So when CEDAW was promulgated, there's just there's a handful of countries that didn't sign on. They did not become signatories. The United States is one of them. There are other countries. I think Iran is not a signatory. There are, North Korea is not a signatory. There are some countries that are not signatories, nor is the US. And when the United States was asked why it hasn't signed on to the most important women's rights declaration in the world, it said, we don't need it because, our women are equal. So again, what does it mean for the American women, who are also fighting for their rights? What does it mean for the organizations there that are working towards an understanding that all American women are not the same? If you look at, African American women, if you look at immigrant American women, everyone again has a very different life story and life chances and so forth. And for the government to say that our women have all achieved equality and so we don't need to bother with, that itself is a gesture of tremendous imperial arrogance, if you will. That there is imperial arrogance in that moment. And so we need to call it what it is. We need to identify it and we need to call it what it is. And I think because it's only after calling out these kinds of things that we might be able to formulate, more equitable relationships. Yeah, so I'm going to end there. And then again, if you have other questions, totally, sort of get back to me and email to me. But thank you so much for being here. And yeah, I give you, thank you.